Okay, so let's unpack this. We need to talk about an interview that dropped late last year, right near the end of 2025.
Right, the piece in The Guardian.
Exact, the Guardian interview with David Gilmour. And, you know, usually when legacy rock stars give interviews, it's about a reissue or a tour or just remembering the good old days. But this felt completely different. This felt like a heavy iron door slamming shut.
It was incredibly final, wasn't it? I think for a lot of fans, there was always this tiny, irrational glimmer of hope that maybe the ice would thaw.
Yeah.
But Gilmour didn't just say no. He said there was absolutely no chance, and that's a direct quote, of ever performing with Roger Waters again.
And the thing that really struck me was his reasoning. He didn't just say, you know, Roger's annoying or don't like his bass playing anymore.
No, no, no.
He made it about something so much deeper. He specifically cited values. And he explicitly mentioned not wanting to share a stage with someone he sees as supporting autocratic dictators.
Which really shifts the entire lens through which we view this band. I mean, for decades, the narrative of Pink Floyd has been this classic clash of egos. You know, the bassist versus the guitarist, the concept guy versus the music guy.
Right, the usual rock and roll drama.
Exactly. But looking at it now, from 2026, it's morphed into this intense moral battle. It's no longer about who gets credit for the tape loops on Money. It's about fundamental worldviews.
So here is the mission for this deep dive. If you're listening, we have pulled together a massive stack of sources for you. We've got band biographies, recent news reports from 2025 and 2026. We've got deep dive forums analyzing their psychology, basically everything we could find.
It's a lot of material.
It is. And we need to figure out how we actually got here. How do we go from a group of college students in London in the 60s to two feuding octogenarians accusing each other of being apologists for dictators?
And if you look at the sources, there's this profound, almost tragic irony hanging over the whole story.
Oh, totally.
Because Pink Floyd is the band that wrote perhaps the most significant music of the 20th century about communication. Or, more accurately, the failure of communication.
Yeah.
They wrote about madness, about alienation, about building walls. And yet, if you look at their actual history, they seem to be the ultimate victims of those exact things. They couldn't communicate. They literally built walls between each other.
It's life imitating art, or maybe art acting as a warning label for their own lives. So let's rewind. We have to go back to the very beginning. London, roughly 1963 to 1965, before the laser shows and the giant flying pigs. Who are these guys?
Well, they were just students at Regent Street Polytechnic. Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright. And this is a detail I always love. They were studying architecture.
Architecture. That feels oddly appropriate for them.
Doesn't it? Because when you think about Pink Floyd's music, it's not just loose jamming. It's structural. It's grand. It has these massive, carefully designed soundscapes.
Like sonic buildings.
Exactly. They were learning how to build physical structures, and eventually they just applied that exact same logic to sound. But early on, they lacked the spark. They were basically just a rhythm section looking for a frontman.
Enter the crazy diamond, Syd Barrett.
Right. Syd was a childhood friend of Roger Waters, but he wasn't an architect. He was an art student. He brought the chaos, the whimsy, and that real psychedelic edge. He's also the one who named the band, which is a story that always gets romanticized. But the reality is pure panic.
Wait, I've heard so many versions of this. Was it not some grand psychedelic vision?
No, it was absolute necessity. They were gigging around London under the name The Tea Set.
The Tea Set. That sounds like a grandmother's bridge club, not a rock band.
I know. And they showed up to a gig one night, and to their absolute horror, another band on the bill was also called The Tea Set.
Oh, no.
So, on the spur of the moment, Syd looked at his record collection. He had an album by two Piedmont blues musicians, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council.
Yeah.
He just mashed their first names together on the spot. The Pink Floyd sound.
So the most iconic name in progressive rock history was basically a last-minute edit to avoid a local trademark dispute.
Pretty much. But with Syd at the helm, they became the absolute darlings of the London underground scene. Places like the UFO Club. This is where they developed that signature sound, you know, the long instrumental improvisations, the liquid light shows. They were basically the house band for the psychedelic revolution.
But this is also where the story takes its first really dark turn. Because we can't talk about Floyd without talking about the tragedy of Syd Barrett. The sources paint a picture of a decline that was just incredibly fast.
Frighteningly fast.
Yeah.
We were talking about a matter of months in 1967. The forum deep dives point to a very specific weekend in May. Syd apparently took a massive amount of LSD, And the description from friends who saw him afterward is just haunting. They said the light in his eyes turned off.
That gave me chills reading it. It wasn't just that he was high, it was that he never quite came back.
He was there physically, but mentally, he was gone. He became completely unpredictable. There are stories of him going on stage and just standing there, detuning his guitar string by string, while the rest of the band is desperately trying to play a song around him. It wasn't rock star rebellion. It was a genuine mental breakdown.
And this leads to what the fans call the Southampton incident. And honestly, looking at our notes, this moment feels like the Rosetta Stone for understanding how this band deals with conflict forever after.
And agree completely.
Yeah.
It's January 1968. The band is in a car, driving to a gig in Southampton. They're all in there. Waters, Mason, Wright, and David Gilmour, who had recently been brought in just to cover for Sid's erratic playing. And someone asked the question, shall we pick up Sid?
And the answer.
Yeah, let's not bother.
That is so brutal. They just drove past his house.
They ghosted him. They didn't have a band meeting. They didn't sit him down and fire him face to face. They just avoided the confrontation entirely and let him drift away. And that exact dynamic, that utter avoidance of direct emotional confrontation, that became the band's default setting for the next 40 years.
So Sid is out. He becomes this ghost that haunts their lyrics forever. But now we enter the 1970s, the golden era. Waters takes over the lyrical control, Gilmour takes the lead vocals and guitar duties, and they release Dark Side of the Moon in 1973.
Which completely changes the stratosphere they exist in. We really have to pause on the magnitude of Dark Side. It stayed on the charts for 741 weeks.
That is 14 years.
Exactly. It turned these former art school students into incredibly wealthy men almost overnight.
The sources mention a massive shift in their lifestyle here. This isn't the cramped van to Southampton anymore.
It's not at all. Roger Waters and Richard Wright bought massive country manor houses. Nick Mason started collecting expensive vintage Ferraris. But here is the tension. Roger Waters is writing lyrics about how money is the root of all evil, about the crushing pressure of modern life, about descending into madness, and simultaneously they are living this life of extreme, isolated excess.
It's the ultimate paradox of success. And that brings us to 1975, and Wish You Were Here. I've always felt this album was the emotional peak of the band.
It is deeply emotional, but it's also incredibly cynical. It's explicitly a tribute to Syd Barrett, obviously with Shine On You Crazy Diamond, but the core theme across the whole record is absence.
Absence.
Yes, not just Syd's absence, but the band's own absence. They were physically in the studio, but mentally they were checking out. They were exhausted. They were incredibly wary of the music industry. You know the cover art for that album.
The two businessmen shaking hands.
Right. Two businessmen in suits, shaking hands in an empty backlot. But one of them is literally on fire.
Which is such a striking, aggressive image.
It symbolizes the fear of getting burned by the industry, of making a corporate deal that destroys your soul. They started referring to themselves as the burning businessmen. They felt like cogs in a machine, not a band of brothers anymore.
And that feeling of being a machine or a product really seemed to trigger Roger Waters. This leads us to the 1977 Animals tour and the infamous spitting incident. I had to double-check the sources on this because it just sounds made up. Did he really spit on a fan?
He really did. It was the final show of the tour in Montreal. There was a group of fans in the front row who were just screaming, shouting for old hits, setting off fireworks. They weren't paying attention to the music. And Waters, who was already feeling deeply alienated from the stadium crowds, just snapped. He leaned over the edge of the stage and spat right in a fan's face.
Talk about a total communication breakdown.
It was a moment of pure disgust. But, and this is what makes Roger Waters who he is, he didn't just wake up the next day and apologize. He went back to the hotel and thought, I feel like there's a literal wall between me and the audience. I want to build that wall.
So his moment of assaulting a fan became the core concept for the wall.
Exactly. He pitched building a literal physical barrier of cardboard bricks between the band and the crowd during the live show. But the underlying tragedy is, as he wrote the wall, he was also building an impenetrable wall between himself and the rest of his bandmates.
The sources describe this era, the late 70s, recording the wall, as the exact moment Waters becomes a dictator. He basically took control of absolutely everything.
He told Rolling Stone years later that no one else in the band should write lyrics because, quote, they'll never be as good as mine. And that hyper-controlling attitude led directly to the purge of Richard Wright.
This is the part of the story that always blows my mind. Wright is a founding member. He's the guy who studied architecture with them in the 60s. And Waters just fires him.
Right in the middle of recording The Wall. Waters felt Wright wasn't contributing enough material. He was totally checked out. So he bullied him into resigning from the band. But here's the insane twist. The massive stadium tour was already booked. They desperately needed a keyboard player who knew the parts. So they hired Richard Wright back.
As an employee.
As a salaried contract musician. The founding member was now just a hired hand on a weekly wage.
That must have been so humiliating for him.
You would think so. But it ends up being the ultimate poetic irony of the entire Pink Floyd saga. The stage show for the wall was unbelievably expensive. The giant puppets, the construction crews building the wall every night, the logistics, the band hemorrhaged money. Gilmour, Mason, and Waters all lost an absolute fortune on that tour.
But Wright was on a fixed salary.
Exactly. Because he was just an employee, he got paid his guaranteed wage, regardless of the tour's profit or loss. Richard Wright was the only member of Pink Floyd who actually made money on the Wall tour.
That is absolutely amazing poetic justice. And speaking of not getting paid, I saw a note in the sources about the kids. The choir on another Brick in the Wall Part 2.
Oh, yes. The students from Islington Green School, they provided that iconic "we don't need no education" chant. They weren't paid a dime. They were given a concert ticket and a free copy of the album.
We don't need no compensation, apparently. So The Wall is a massive cultural hit, but behind the scenes, the band is totally broken. We get to 1983 and the final cut, which the sources basically describe as a Roger Waters solo album in all but name.
Gilmour isn't even credited as a producer on that one. He basically just showed up, played his guitar parts, and left. The band was running on fumes. And then in 1985, the inevitable finally happens. Roger Waters quits.
And this is where the Cold War turns into a very hot war. Waters didn't just leave, he assumed Pink Floyd was completely over, right?
He publicly called the band a spent force creatively. He genuinely believed that without him, the main lyricist, the big concept guy, the others couldn't possibly function or write a record. So when Gilmour and Mason announced they were going to carry on, Waters sued them. He tried to legally block them from ever using the name Pink Floyd.
This lawsuit sounds incredibly petty from the sources.
It was a brutal war of attrition. Nick Mason, who loved his expensive car collection, actually had to use his Ferrari 250 GTO as a collateral to borrow money to fund their new tour because Waters had tied up all their corporate assets in court.
You know you were deeply committed to spiting your ex-bandmate when you pawned the vintage Ferrari. But there is a detail in here about the flying pig that just sums up this whole ridiculous era for me.
The flying pig, yes. So the giant inflatable pig was a staple of their live shows, but the specific design of the pig was Roger Waters' intellectual property. He legally owned the copyright on that exact pig shape.
So Gilmour and Mason couldn't use the pig on their new tour.
They could, but only if they changed it enough to be legally distinct. So, to avoid copyright infringement, the new Gilmour-led Pink Floyd created a huge inflatable pig that had, well, very distinct male genitalia added to it.
Wait, they literally put testicles on the pig just to avoid a lawsuit?
They gave the pig balls to make it legally distinct from Roger's copyrighted pig. That is the exact level of pettiness we are dealing with here.
That is hilarious and incredibly depressing at the same time. So Waters eventually lost that legal battle. The Gilmour-led Floyd released A Momentary Lapse of Reason and The Division Bell, and they went out and filled stadiums all over the world. They proved they could be a massive commercial success without Roger.
Which I think probably stung Roger more than anything else. But for decades after that, it was mostly just icy silence in the press. Until 2005. Live 8.
I remember watching this clearly. Bob Geldof somehow convinced them to reunite for global charity. It was just 4 songs.
It felt like an absolute miracle at the time. To see them actually on stage together, Gilmour, Waters, Mason, and Wright. And at the very end of the set, there's that famous group hug. And for a brief moment, the whole world thought, okay, the war is finally over.
But it wasn't a new beginning at all. It was a finale.
It was the very last time the classic lineup ever played together. Syd Barrett died the next year in 2006. Richard Wright tragically passed away in 2008. And with Rick gone, the idea of a true Pink Floyd reunion became completely impossible in Gilmour's eyes.
Gilmour released The Endless River in 2014, basically as a tribute to Wright, using unreleased ambient sessions from the 90s. And he said, this is it, the end. And it really should have been. It was a graceful, quiet fade out for a loud band.
It would have been a perfect, peaceful ending. But geopolitics has a really nasty way of dragging things back into the light.
Which brings us to the modern era, the Ukraine single in 2022. Hey, rise up.
This is a crucial turning point. Gilmour and Mason revived the Pink Floyd name, which they swore they hadn't touched in years, specifically to release a protest song against the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And this is exactly where the feud shifts from, who wrote the bass lines to values, as Gilmour put it, because Roger Waters has taken a profoundly different stance on that conflict.
He has, and we have to be clear about what the sources say here to be balanced. Waters argues that his stance is entirely anti-war. He states he is criticizing the expansion of NATO and looking at Western geopolitical provocation. He sees himself as a truth-teller fighting against Western propaganda. But to Gilmour, and to many others reading his interviews, his comments sounded like apologies for the invasion itself.
And that simmering tension totally exploded on Twitter, or X, in 2023.
Yeah.
This wasn't a subtle, passive-aggressive dig in a Rolling Stone interview. This was Polly Sampson, Gilmour's wife and the band's primary lyricist for the last 30 years, just going nuclear.
She tweeted directly at Roger, and I'm reading the source here because the language is genuinely shocking. She called him anti-Semitic, to your rotten core, and a Putin apologist, among several other very harsh things.
And Gilmour, he didn't just stay out of it or stay silent.
No. He quoted her tweet on his own account and added, "Every word demonstrably true."
Demonstrably true. That is a bridge not just burned, but absolutely nuked from orbit.
It made the old 1980s arguments about the flying pig look like child's play. This was character assassination on a massive public stage. And Waters retaliated, of course. He went into the studio and re-recorded Dark Side of the Moon entirely solo.
The Redux album? I listened to parts of this when it dropped. He stripped out all the guitar solos.
He did, and the sources suggest the intent behind that was very specific. It wasn't just an artistic cover version. It was a blatant statement of ownership. By removing the soaring guitar solos, which are Gilmour's absolute signature, Waters was trying to say, the genius of this album isn't the rock star guitar stuff. It's the words. It's the grand message. It's me.
It feels like he was literally trying to erase Gilmour from the history of their biggest record. Which finally brings us to 2024, the massive catalog sale. Pink Floyd sold their recorded music rights to Sony for $400 million.
A staggering payout. But, usually when legacy bands do this, it's just estate planning or a final cash grab. Gilmour's motivation, according to his own interviews, was completely fascinating. He explicitly said it wasn't just about the money.
What was the real reason then?
He said he wanted to, quote, be rid of the decision-making and the arguments.
So wait, is it fair to say he effectively accepted a $400 million check just so he never had to send another email to Roger Waters again?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Because they operated as a partnership. Every time they wanted to license a song for a movie or approve a vinyl re-release, they needed unanimous consent. That meant engaging with Waters. Selling the rights to Sony was basically an incredibly expensive divorce settlement. It was the price of permanent peace.
Which leads us right back to where we started this whole conversation. That late 2025 interview where Gilmour says, absolutely no chance. It seems like the Sony sale was the final act of severing the tie.
It really is. The corporate structure is dismantled. The shared assets are gone. The architects have permanently left the building. Gilmour is doing his solo albums now, like Luck and Strange, and he's made it clear he is done with the mudslinging.
It's a really tragic ending, in a way. The legacy of Pink Floyd is this incredible duality. They created the most beautiful, timeless music about madness, about absence, and the profound lack of communication, all while living out those exact same fatal problems in their own personal relationships.
It's totally true.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We spent this entire deep dive talking about how miserable these guys made each other. The bullying, the spitting, the lawsuits, the vicious tweets. But you have to wonder, would the music have been as groundbreaking if they were just four happy friends who got along?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? Honestly, I don't think so. I really think the friction was the fuel. You desperately needed the grounded, melodic, beautiful, musical sensibility of David Gilmour to rein in the abrasive, conceptual mania of Roger Waters. And conversely, you needed Waters' bitter bite to keep Gilmour's music from just becoming pretty floating soundscapes. The intense tension between those two opposing worldviews is what created the spark. If they had actually liked each other, we probably wouldn't be doing a deep dive on them 50 years later.
A heavy thought for a remarkably heavy band. They shone on, even if they completely burned each other out in the process. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.